Good evening, everyone. I just want to welcome you all to Optimizing Dancer Potential. This series invites dance scientists, somatic practitioners, and dance artists to share their knowledge and experience of working in dance and with dancers to improve health, performance, well-being, and creativity. And I think creativity is really important, and I think that's part of tonight's discussion. Tonight, I'm really excited to introduce my friend and colleague, Lucie Clements, who will be joining us tonight, which actually is her morning because she's joining us from the UK. Lucie is a dancer, author, educator, dance psychologist who researches, teaches, coaches in the area of dance psychology, psychological well-being. Since completing her PhD at Trinity Laban in London, Lucie has been working as a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Chichester. She is currently a performing arts psychologist at Momentum Performing Arts Academy and works freelance across a number of schools, companies in the UK and around the globe. And I know that Lucie has done some work with One Dance UK, which is a really important organisation in the UK, which is dedicated to dancers' health and well-being, amongst some of the other things they do. But tonight, Lucie is going to share her research and experience of working with dancers who are expected to be both technically and creatively skilled. Yet these two goals have conflicting psychological demands. One is about refining and honing, and the other is about open-mindedness and being daring. Lucie is going to share with us why it's so important to manage perfectionism in dance, and to promote open-mindedness to encourage creative thinking. So Lucie, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, look, it's so exciting. And I think probably the best thing to do is to start with telling our audience a little bit about who you are and your career in dance.
Yeah, sure. So I actually often feel like a little bit of a fraud when I speak to and work with such phenomenal dancers, because I don't have a professional dance career myself, but I'm one of those children that fell in love with dance, did an awful lot of dance, singing, played the piano, played the clarinet. My whole childhood and development was based around the context of performance. And I think that for me is really interesting now when I look at dancers and work with dancers, because I know that my own development as a human being was so heavily informed by those hours that I was training and dancing and aiming for a career in dance. And when I was in my teens, I had a very bad injury, which was very poorly understood, both by my dance teachers, particularly the ballet teachers, which kind of happened around that time where it should have been progressing for me. It should have been becoming the career that I was going to pursue. So I had my whole kind of teenage years were really formed by this experience of this very complex relationship with dance, where I thought that that's what I was going to do. I was going through all of that adolescent development and then dealing with this injury on top. So in hindsight now, I'm actually quite pleased that happened, not the physical and psychological pain that I went through, but what that allowed me to do was to think about what I wanted to do. And actually at quite a young age, I decided that I wanted to be a psychologist for dancers, mostly because of the experience that I was having with my own mental health at that time. And because of some of the teaching that I was having. And I was almost very aware, even at the age of kind of 15 or 16, that the way that I was being spoken to and that the way that that was being managed was really bad for my mental health. So that led me towards psychology. And actually, even at that early stage of first studying psychology in school and at A-level in the UK, there were things that I was reading about dance psychology. And I think we often think that it's a really new thing to look at the psychology of dance, but it actually isn't, because there is research into dances that's been happening for kind of 40 years or so. So I never had the performance career. I went and studied psychology, but from day one of that studying of psychology, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and this was what I wanted. Yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, I think you've kind of already taken us to that place of why psychology, why performance psychology. And it might be useful just to help our audience understand the difference between performance psychology and dance psychology, if there is a difference.
Well, it's interesting because I suppose in a way dance psychology isn't really a thing. It doesn't particularly exist. So it's not a recognized or regulated in any way field. So when I call myself a dance psychologist, I think there's often a lot of confusion about what that is. And people tend to think that that means that I'm a clinical psychologist, which I'm not. There's a really I think poor understanding of the different roles that are available in mental health. So performance psychology really draws on principles from sport, but also other domains as well. So even things like what's known as occupational, organizational psychology. So it's about really understanding how psychology functions in any domain where you want performance. So performance psychologists even look at things like surgeons, for example. So how can we get a surgeon to wake up in the middle of the night and perform an emergency surgery and not make mistakes, for example, and what processes are involved in decision making. So performance psychology really looks at how to develop and get the best out of people across broader contexts. The one that would be the kind of most commonly understood domain of performance is obviously sport. So part of what I do and how I work draws on sports psychology and principles from sports psychology. But what I love about the concept of performance psychology is that actually any profession or kind of training environment is quite relevant when you look at that information applied in dance. So it's great because I get to look at all sorts of different kind of demanding environments and learn from those, and how can we draw that into dance. And I think it's interesting because a lot of the time when I've worked in dance, I think there's a real feeling that you have to have been a dancer, or you have to have research or evidence that comes from dance for that to be relevant. But I'm not sure so much that I agree with that. I think we need to understand how it functions in dance, but actually most performance contexts are quite similar when you look at the demands of what's being asked for people to do, cognitively, performance-wise, emotionally. The giving is quite similar. Obviously, dance has additional demands, particularly the aesthetic one that maybe you don't see in other performance-based domains, but fundamentally the demands are quite similar. So what I really love is being able to read and draw on other areas of performance, or where skill and expertise is being developed, and then use that to inform what we know about dance, which I have to say is one of the things that I've really loved about working in a psychology department, and how I've really been able to look at psychology as a really broad whole and learn how bits of that might apply in the dance context.
I'm kind of curious also as to how the work that you're doing, or what aspects of the work that you're doing, do you think applies most directly to dancers? Before we get into the area that you're going to share a little bit more around perfectionism, but perhaps maybe just talk a little bit about why it's important for dancers to consider psychology, or even conservatoires like ours or Trinity Laban need to consider psychology as part of the training of professional dancers.
Yeah, for me, the answer is kind of quite obvious, because really, if we think about it, the second someone walks into a dance studio, we start giving them information which requires the brain. So anything that the body is doing is controlled by the brain. So if we want the dancer to become a better dancer, or change their eating habits, or learn to drink more water, all of the other kind of physical things that we're much better at talking about, that is all regulated by the brain and by the mind. So even if we, for example, want the dancer to integrate kind of better strength and conditioning training, or buy into that, the barrier to that is all psychological. So anything that a dancer or a performer is doing is driven by the mind and by the brain. So I think even in dance science, there's still a greater tendency to think about the physical side of things, but actually those physical things that we're trying to make changes in, or changes that we're trying to implement, are still regulated by the mind. So it's probably better to look at the mind first, and then understand how that is functioning in order for the physical changes to occur as well. I mean, like, we think about dance as being the body, and the body is really important, but the body is entirely controlled by the brain and by the mind. So I find it kind of fascinating that people still question what the relevance of psychology would be in dance, because everything about being a dancer, from movement to motivation to musicality, is psychology. Dancing is psychology, basically, in my opinion.
Which is fascinating, because if you look at the percentage of time which is spent around thinking about dance, or psychology of dance, or the psychology of the dancers, or giving the dancers psychological skills training, and the amount of time we spend in the studio physically training the body, that from what you've just said, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and even, you know, anything that we're asking a dancer to do, whether that's to look after an injury, or to go and seek extra support, or to remember something in a different way, that's requiring psychology. So I think, you know, I think there is so much potential for dance psychology. And I think at the moment, what we do know and what has been researched and what's been understood is just such a small little slice of what there is to understand about the role of the mind and the brain in dance. So yeah, I'm fascinated to see where the field goes, and see how, I think one of the big challenges that people think that psychology is only about mental health. So it's only about kind of fixing people or stopping people who are, you know, trying to help people who have anxiety or depression. But actually that's just one tiny slice of the pie of what psychology can contribute towards a dancer. And I think we need to kind of overcome that barrier that talking about psychology means talking about mental health only, because it also means talking about learning and how do we give feedback and just the fundamental things of how a class is set up. And then actually, if you change those bits of it, or do those better informed by science about memory or about how to deliver feedback, as a consequence, we might be changing the health outcomes anyway in terms of mental health. And that's where I think it's really important that the dance kind of community understands the different roles of different psychologists, that there's this kind of fixing end of it, where we could look at how to help people who have concerns with their mental health, but also psychology plays a role at the very start as well. So from that first time a child walks into the dance studio, what can we be doing to promote good well-being and good engagement in dance as well, which is where my interest really lies, and why I'm really interested in the teacher and the environment of how can we enter into a place that better supports learning and development, rather than necessarily have to fix it on the end. And I had a really lovely conversation with a clinical psychologist the other day, who said to me that she thinks that the work that performance psychologists or people like me do is potentially more important than what she could do, because if we were doing that, we wouldn't need her. We wouldn't need the clinical psychologist to kind of resolve problems that emerge if there were more people doing the groundwork in the studio, working with teachers, having these kind of educational conversations. And she said to me, because she works in dance and in sport, that for her, a success for her in sport is that as a clinical psychologist, I don't have to go to the Olympics with the athlete that I'm working with, because I know that they can go there without me, and that, you know, that job is done. And I think that we could probably move better towards that in dance, where we need less people sorting problems at the end of it if we started the journey better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting, because I think it parallels a lot with some of the work that we do in dance science around, you know, we want to prevent the injuries, we want to prevent the issues going forward, rather than trying to fix them at the other end. It's great knowing that we have better management strategies and better recuperation and recovery strategies, but if we didn't have to use those, then the dancers would be in peak performance the entire time. So it's about, you know, optimizing performance, which is interesting, because that's really, or optimizing potential, which is really what this series is about. Now, I think this brings us really beautifully into the work that you're doing around perfectionism and creativity. So can you talk a little bit about your research and how that's being applied, or how you see it being applied?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I did my PhD in creativity at Trinity Laban, which is obviously when we first met, and the work that I was doing was looking at how we could develop creativity specifically in contemporary dances. And I think that worked really well. That project was really successful because contemporary dance, Trinity Laban, the people that we were working with as consultants on that project, were really open to this importance of developing creativity. And the project worked quite well. We were able to show that our kind of what I'd call a scientific creativity intervention of teaching about the science of creativity, we were able to improve the students' creativity, both on kind of like a classic psychology test and in the teacher's perceptions of creativity. And then the interesting thing for me coming to the end of that, as someone who had trained in ballet and whose interest is really in kind of very classical dance forms. The interesting thing for me then was, would this information ever be accepted in ballet? Would a ballet school ever say, come on in and help people to be more creative? And that led me to some really beautiful conversations with our good colleague and friend, Dr. Sanna Norden-Bates, who was researching perfectionism, has kind of really led the way in understanding perfectionism from a research perspective, particularly in ballet dancers. So then we had some really interesting conversations about this idea that potentially they're kind of this focus on being perfect in ballet might actually not only be preventing the development of creative thinking, but actually really like actively suppressing it. So if we look at kind of what's going on in the thought process of a perfectionist, it's very much about kind of honing in, narrowing in on doing it in one very specific way. And we know that perfectionism doesn't have much flexibility in it. So it's like, I want to achieve it in this one very particular way. Whereas everything that I'd been doing in that research project at Trinity Lab and looking at creativity was about kind of increasing mental flexibility. And when a psychologist measures creativity, fundamentally, the way that we kind of boil it down to who is more or less creative, it is basically who can break away from this very habitual way of looking at things and open up their creativity. So I think as a result of that, I've just become very interested in whether ballet is possibly preventing the development of creative thinking by developing this very kind of narrow focus on there's this one way of doing things. So that's where my work has become quite interesting, and we started with qualitative work to really just understand these concepts and these ideas about is that very technical, refined way of doing things kind of counterintuitive if you want to be creative. And fundamentally the answer is yes, because one is about honing in. I'm finding this one very specific way to do it that's dictated by the history books, that I must think in this way and perform in this way. And the other one is very much about I overcome that habit and I break free and I have the confidence to do it as well. So I think one of the important things is that we know too that perfectionism can really lead to kind of reduced self-esteem or feeling able to put yourself out there as well. Whereas if we want a dancer to be quite creative, we also need them to have the confidence to not only have the idea, but to say, look at me, like I've got this idea, I want to share it, and to trust in those ideas. So that's where my interest has really lied, and where I find it really kind of fascinating, particularly when we look at the reality of a professional ballet career now, that dancers are asked to replicate the traditional ballets, but also be involved in kind of creative processes as well and give to that creative process. And I've met quite a few ballet dancers just because of these conversations that I'm now having that have said, like, you're completely right, I just cannot do it. I freeze every time. Actually, one of the things that I've always reflected on the most is the Adams dance parties. Because actually I have noticed that, being a psychologist, always observing that even when we go to Adams, you can see that there are dancers there that don't want to get on the dance floor and dance. And that's kind of, I guess, what this idea is that fear of letting free, that fear of being evaluated, I guess. And I think we could probably all know professional dancers or very successful dancers that don't like dancing in public. So I suppose it's really about those kind of psychological underpinnings of what's going on there, and how is that one very rigid way of training preventing people from having the confidence of breaking free, I guess.
I wonder if it's probably now it would be, a good time to talk a little bit about what perfectionism is. And, I often hear people talk about perfectionism in dance and say, oh, but it's a good thing. It's about discipline. It's about working hard. It's about, not being second. It's about all these things. Isn't that a good thing for dance?
Yeah, okay. So perfectionism theory, the kind of psychology of perfectionism, always historically used to kind of posit in this way that there were good and bad sides of it. So it's multidimensional. You've got good aspects and you've got bad aspects. So the less good aspects, or the kind of maladaptive aspects, might be that you're very self-critical, that you're striving so hard that you might even procrastinate. So there is a relationship between being a perfectionist and procrastinating. And then historically, well, the theory said, but there are good perfectionists. So some people will fit into the category of having a good form or an adapted form of perfectionism. So that's around being really ambitious, striving hard, very focused, driving towards it. But the interesting thing is when you look at the data on it, so when we actually look at data on it, you're very, very unlikely to find somebody who has the good without the bad. So is there really anybody who fits solely into the category of I've got the good traits without the bad? So that's why in the literature it's discussed as being what's called like a double-edged sword. So you're very unlikely to have the good parts of it without the bad. And then if you've got kind of the traits of the positive traits of perfectionism, there's the probability or risk that they may become unhealthy anyway. So yes, it's great that I'm striving so hard and I'm very focused and ambitious, but actually, is that then going to lead me to being so self-critical when I don't meet those goals anyway? So I think the dialogue, at least in sports psychology and performance psychology, is don't glamorize this idea of perfectionism. Let's not ever say that it's a good thing. And there's much more of a shift towards reframing it as being kind of striving for excellence. And when you distinguish between the characteristics of what you see in someone who's a perfectionist versus this concept of striving for excellence, the excellence mindset is much more flexible and more aligned with maybe what creativity requires as well. So that is more associated with I'm trying really hard, but I'll give myself a break as well. And I really want this and I'm committed and I'm driven. But at the same time, there is a point at which I can say no and I can be kinder towards myself and more self-compassionate as well. So I think I'm really anti the promotion of the idea that perfectionism is a good thing. And I think there's a shift away from that. I do think that there is a bit of a move where people kind of generally understand that. And I think maybe when we were together at Lab and when I was doing some workshops and stuff, I used to always start with put your hand up if you're a perfectionist, and most people would put it up, and I'd say keep your hand up if you think it's good. And back then, maybe like 7 years ago when I started doing this, people kept their hand up more, but now I've noticed that there's a transition that more people are aware that it's not quite so desirable to be a perfectionist anymore, or there's not such pride in self-labeling perfectionism now. I think before it was like I'm a perfectionist and I'm proud of it, whereas people now understand more that that's not a positive label to be calling yourself a perfectionist. And that's my feeling of it in the people that I'm working with. And I think that at least some of the kind of directors and teachers that I'm working with are starting to understand that the pressure of the expectations around perfectionism might not be quite as good as what we might have thought 10 years ago.
How do you think we contribute to that? You know, the dance teachers, the dance academics, the choreographers. What is it that we are doing that's perpetuating this kind of idea of perfectionism as opposed to excellence? I love that distinction between those two things. Yeah, so I'm just curious about the sorts of things that you might have noticed that people are doing.
Yeah, I think it's very much just about the way that feedback is delivered. Again, this is where I think just simple things like helping people to think about the way that you phrase your feedback. So a lot of it is just language. So if you're telling people that wasn't good enough, you have to do it again, that's a very different thing to saying, shall we try that again and see if we could do it in a different way. So it's about the ways that you're doing it, because one is there's a standard here and you've not met it, whereas the other one is you're here, can we move you up? So it's kind of about rotating and reversing the way that you're giving it. And in some of the research that I've done recently, I was invited onto a research project with some sports psychologists that were researching youth dance contexts. And in that, we looked at the relationship between these different kind of categories of perfectionism. So the people who were just the good, just the bad, or the mixed profile, which is where you've got the kind of good and the bad traits of perfectionism. I'm using good and bad in a very kind of loose way here, but the kind of the healthier and the less healthy aspects of it. And we looked at those kind of sub profiles and how that relates to health related outcomes. So in particular, we were interested in burnout. So this is when you're kind of experiencing emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion, and it's kind of coupled with a bit of a cynicism. So almost like, why am I doing this anymore? Why did I give my heart and soul to dancing for this? And actually in that paper, what we found is it's a bit complicated statistically, but essentially if you take a perfectionist with the more maladaptive traits, or a mixed profile where they've got the presence of the negative traits as well, but put them into the training context where the teacher is supporting them positively, so providing them with autonomy support, or giving them this kind of more generous way of teaching where you're being essentially kind to them, helping them to grow, that changes that probability that they're going to get burnt out. So basically the teacher becomes really, really important in managing a perfectionistic dancer. So we can take a dancer who is perfectionist either because they've been in the dancing environment or because they come into the dancing environment as a perfectionist. And actually, if you locate them in a context where the teacher or director is working within that and helping them to respond to feedback in a different way, you can change the health outcomes as well. And this is something that's quite well understood now in kind of the performance psychology literature, that actually the teacher can become quite an important influence on mediating that relationship between, here's a person that comes into a context. The teacher essentially has the power to change some degree of the health outcomes for that person, which I think is really, really important, that we educate teachers as well about how to create that kind of environment where you manage the perfectionism through effective feedback, through kindness, through working with it, not inflating it. So the opposite thing happens too. So if you've got a perfectionist and the teacher is putting a lot of pressure on them, so doing the opposite, autonomy thwarting, you're going to increase the probability of burnout, essentially. That's a really simplified way of explaining the statistics, but that's kind of what it's showing.
Well, it's really exciting to hear that someone can come into an environment as a perfectionist with those traits, but we can help either manage them, or we can help them out of that kind of that loop where they get into that self-critical loop, that avoidant loop, all those other behavioral traits that come with perfectionism. We can actually help them to be more successful. That's great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I'm curious, just going back to how this intersects into creativity then. So we have a dance class environment that might be driven towards perfectionism, just because of the environment, and that's no reflection on the people within the environment, but that's just the environment might be driving it towards that. And so in an environment where now dancers are no longer just the performing artists in the work of somebody else, they're often the contributing artists within the creative process. And how then does this striving for excellence, the kind of pursuit of, I'm going to say perfectionism, how does that kind of clash with this idea of creating creative, open-minded, flexible thinking? Yeah.
Well, let's imagine the choreographer says, okay, here's an image or a task that you're going to work with, and I just want you to create like 8 counts of movement. The perfectionist is going to be like, whoa, what? Because that that mentality is more like, I follow, and I know I'm in my comfort zone of knowing that this is how I do it. And if they've been training in classical ballet for quite a while, what they've been doing is learning to replicate and hone in on where does the arm go? What do I need to do to follow orders? So that's the idea, really, that this perfectionistic kind of mindset might basically just create this barrier to being open to that. So anytime I give you a problem to solve, whether it's creating something choreographically, whether it's one of my creativity tasks that I use in my research, or just something that I want you to help me with in life, your brain can either kind of shut off or open the gate. So is your brain going to go to like, there's one answer, I need to find that one answer to this. And as soon as your brain does that and tells you I'm looking for the perfect solution to this, there's only one solution, you disengage your creative thinking processes. So that essentially is what classical ballet kind of trains people to do, is to hone in on that one solution. So in cognitive psychology, that's called convergent thinking. So I'm converging on the correct answer. So it's like when we learn maths in school, we learn convergent thinking. There's one answer to this problem. There's one way to do it. And I got to stick with following the rules. Whereas if in these kind of more neoclassical contexts, if the choreographer is asking the dancer to create movement, you need to use what's called divergent thinking. So I'm going to think openly, I'm going to override this tendency to just do what I already know. So what the likelihood is that if we've only trained this quite rigid way of you follow technique and class is always structured like this, when we ask somebody to be creative, they're going to go to what they know. So they're going to come to like a sequence of steps that they've done 100 times before because their brain is programmed to do it in that particular way. So we need to kind of train from my ideas, and mine and Sana's ideas is that we've got to train from earlier some inclusion in technique of opening up those channels for creative thinking, so that when we're asking professionals to contribute, they're more likely to be able to open up that kind of divergent thinking, so accessing lots of different ideas.
Which is interesting because I think this comes beautifully into some of our questions. I'm just going to go to our questions. So our first question is Jaiji Lee. And do you think it is ballet, or is it just how ballet teachers, dancers are approaching ballet that makes it restrictive and suppresses creativity?
It's interesting. I think it's part of it's embedded in the tradition of ballet. So ballet as a form is, we follow, it's documented, it's notated, we watch how it's been done before and then we copy it. So part of it is in the tradition of ballet as an art form. But I think, I suppose teachers are a part of ballet, aren't they? Because then a teacher trains does a qualification or trains themselves in an environment that's only teaching that. So I think if we changed the teachers, if we trained teachers to be more creative, or train teachers that in part of your dance class you include something creative, that would change it. But for me, the answer with making changes in practice is always to look at who's regulating any sort of training or anything like that. So if we made it compulsory for teachers to learn a bit about creativity and a bit about how does this feed into how you're going to structure your class or what you're going to ask of your students to do, then I think that would change the art form as well. But I think I see some teachers do it. I go to ballet classes, my poor ballet teachers. When I go in my ballet classes and I tell them what I do, and then they look me up on Instagram, and I think they probably think, oh my God, she's gonna judge me really hard. But I have found some teachers who are ballet teachers who are really good at doing this. So they're finding ways of overcoming that very kind of traditional view of how to teach ballet. And typically that's because they're also trained in contemporary dance as well, which I think is really interesting, where they've got that dual influence, that the contemporary dance training is helping them to be more open with how they're teaching. And in general, I think that's great if a teacher has all these different kind of influences on their teaching style, they're going to also be more open to. So it's a really difficult question to answer, but I think if we taught teachers to be more comfortable with creativity, then it might help it. The thing I find the most fascinating thing, though, if we think about it, when a child walks into a ballet class at like 2-3 years old, I'm just thinking if you're a stereotype of a girl in a little pink outfit or a boy, that is creative. Like what you ask a little child to do is creative. It's like run around, be a princess, now walk on your, walk around as if you're a soldier. So where did that goes somewhere? It gets lost. But that's the thing I find really interesting, is when we start, ballet is creative and it's about promoting creative thinking. But then the syllabus hits and it's all gone. So if only we could kind of keep parts of those early days of how we train small children, that might really change things.
I'm curious, actually. Have you done any work with the RAD? Have you talked to Katie about any of this?
No, I never have, actually. I had I did an interview on a podcast, and I had a few RAD teachers reaching out to me and saying, oh my goodness, this is fascinating, because I've thought this as well. I've had that temptation to just at the end of it whack out a bit of improvisation or do something. So I think that that's the ultimate goal, isn't it, for somewhere like the RAD or the ISTD to say, how can we implement this? But yeah, it would be really interesting, wouldn't it, to look at that? Because it's not actually anything groundbreaking that I'm suggesting either. It's not really that.
No, and it's I think we should say right now that there are incredibly creative ballet teachers, and there are incredibly creative teachers across the entire spectrum of dance that are probably promoting a lot of these things. And then possibly there are some teachers who this is for them, this is not comfortable. If you're not comfortable, then you're not going to go into that place.
Yeah, I mean, even my sister is an RAD ballet teacher, and we've discussed it quite a lot. And I just know, how she is and the training that she's had. And even though she understands everything that I'm doing and wholly supports it, that as a teacher, it probably just wouldn't sit comfortably with her to do the things that I'm suggesting. But that, again, is just because of her training and the training that she's had and how she's developed as a teacher as well. So that's why I think, if it came into the training, it would be better. But you are totally right that there are many teachers doing amazing things and doing it of their own kind of volition. And I often go and watch a class and learn a new thing about how people are doing it. And that's what I love, is when I get to observe something and I see it a way a teacher is doing what I'm suggesting, but they found their own way of doing it, and then I learn back from it, which is why I love some of the work that I get to do where I just observe and I can see it playing out in practice, and it's just really exciting. I was watching something recently where I was just observing as a consultant, and it was just a really simple way that they were asking the dancers to improvise on Zoom, and then it was like you pick up someone else's improvisation and then you kind of swap it all around, and I'd never seen it like that, but they were really promoting so many good things in autonomy, creativity, individuality, confidence, and I love when I see a teacher finding a way to do it that I can take it away and be like, that was a really nice way of doing it, and feed back to them from a psychological perspective why that's so healthy what they're doing and so good for them.
And that's beautiful, because I think that brings us straight into Angie Lee's comment then question. As a ballet teacher, it also appears to me that teaching ballet under a syllabus for a period of time really does affect my creativity on my choreographic skills. What suggestions, Lucie, would you give for this sort of situation in teaching?
Yeah, that's an interesting one as well, isn't it? Because when you look at ballet teachers, often they choreograph themselves in quite a restricted way as well, because they're also just following the ways of doing it. So I suppose also then maybe, my suggestion would be, and I know that there are all sorts of practical implications, but in syllabus classes, finding time where you're doing creative things that are for the students, but also for you as well. So even if you're kind of improvising or introducing tasks, that you're part of that as well, that you're maybe losing that kind of hierarchy that you're the teacher and you're the students, and you're doing it together. So you're using it to kind of develop your own creativity. But I think if you're aware of that, I think finding solutions is really important. And I think we never really think about the teacher in dance psychology so much. We always think about how is the teacher impacting on the students. But I think it's really important to also think about how can the teacher get the most out of that as well. And maybe it's just sometimes breaking free from that syllabus and having one lesson in your block of 10 or something where it's an opportunity for you all to create together. Because one of the things that we kind of know is really good for dance creativity is the breaking down of the hierarchy as well. So students are more likely to be creative if they perceive that the teacher is or choreographer or director is one of them as well. So I'm not being assessed here for my creativity. There's no kind of value judgment on this. So I think creating together or improvising together as well, or finding tasks that you can do together where you are with the students rather than separate from the students, is probably good for your own creativity too.
Yeah. It's such a difficult thing to do, isn't it? Because I think the being judged is a major hurdle for most of us in any situation. So to put yourself at the same level, or to be vulnerable in front of your students, for a lot of us is quite a challenging thing to do. Now, which brings us. Actually, I'm sorry, Lucie, I was just going to say, Jeanette has a question for us. What about the teacher's sense of control and power in their authoritative position versus the supportive role that they could play, especially in classical ballet and those who value the control and intimidation? Ooh, okay. So the power dynamics.
Yeah, okay, good question. I think I think it's really important to say that you can still be in a position of authority whilst being supportive as well. And I think it's about learning how to retain that authority position whilst also being supportive. And you know, there are times in a process as well. So if you're nearing exams or if you're nearing performances where maybe that authority needs to become greater again. So I don't think it's one or the other, that you can't be authoritative without being supportive. And then moving to the second part of it, that's a really tricky one. And it's a really tricky one for a psychologist to answer, because I would argue that anyone who values the control and intimidation shouldn't be valuing that control and intimidation, and that's a kind of a risky, I guess, a risky view to think that anyone has of their own autonomy decided to value it. If that's all they've ever known, that value doesn't necessarily stem from a place of awareness or autonomous decision that I'm going to value it. So I think we just have to be wary about saying she likes it, because if we think about it, I'm not at all comparing, but if we think about in another relationship where we might say, oh, that person likes being dominated, or that person likes to be told off, if that's all they've ever known, they haven't really had an opportunity to decide that they dislike it. So I think it's really important to not value being controlled or being intimidated, but value receiving feedback and learning from feedback. So I'm not saying we don't want to give people feedback and we don't want to tell people that they can improve, but it's about valuing that in a growth-based way. So I hear that I need to get better and I want to get better and I'm invested in getting better, not that's the only way I can get better by being intimidated, and that intimidation equals improvement. I think good feedback will lead to improvement, rather than somebody valuing thinking that is the only way I can improve if I am criticized. It is possibly a way that would lead to improvement, but I think we need to not think that that's normal and that that's acceptable. That was a really convoluted answer to that question.
It's really interesting. You got me thinking about, I've been doing a lot of reading recently with relationship therapy, and the Gottmans, who have written a lot and done a lot of research in relationships. And I often think about this in terms of dance and the relationship between choreographers and dancers, or teachers and dancers, because it's a relationship. Now, if you are with your partner and you're constantly giving them criticism, because that will make them better. Let me point out all the things you do wrong, and that will make you a better person. And that's going to help our relationship, because if I can make you a better person by pointing out all the things that you do wrong, then our relationship is going to be better. And just that kind of way of thinking, that flawed way of thinking, and we know in a relationship, in an intimate relationship, that's just a disaster. But actually in a teaching relationship too, with dance, we're often focused around helping someone get better by pointing out the mistakes that they make or the faults that they have in an attempt to get better and better. And that then feeds into that perfectionist type behavior and that perfectionist type loop, because the way that you're getting attention, or the way that you're getting, or you're knowing you're getting better, is by correcting the faults, correcting the things which have been pointed out to you by someone else. So then again, that comes into the control.
Yeah. And I just think we just have to be really careful, because once someone has established and normalized a behavior, so it's normal to be treated that way, they can then say, I want this, I like this. But if they've never experienced anything else, they don't have that critical view. They don't have that possibility to look at it from another lens. I mean, it's just the same thing if you think about like your parents' parenting style. It's very difficult to imagine a different circumstance because you've only lived that one. So I would always just worry when anybody says, but I like this, because they haven't had that opportunity to try anything else. So I think it's really important. That would worry me, I think, if anybody ever said to me that I value being intimidated. I think we need to kind of step away from, if someone says that to us, of saying, oh, okay, then, that there's a step further beyond that we question that and we critique that and we think, is that acceptable for somebody to be saying that, which is difficult when you're not a psychologist, or even for me as a psychologist, knowing where to take that. But I think it's just about that kind of critical awareness of that's also not an acceptable place to be, just the same as it wouldn't be in a relationship if we heard a friend telling us, oh, I don't mind him criticizing me, it's how I get better. Our signals would go off like, whoa, you're not this is not a good place to be. So I think we should have those same kind of concerns if we hear people expressing that I like it or that's how I get better.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. We have another question from Peggy. And there are many professional ballet dancers that are perfectionists, since they are focusing too much on their weaknesses, which causes a number of mental health issues such as low self-esteem and anxiety. I'm working on some research on mental health in professional ballet dancers, mainly focusing on their anxiety towards their career trajectory. Do you have any advice for our ballet dancers?
Oh, okay. So just drawing on my interest in the creativity thing and this relationship, I think one of the things that I've learned the most through the work that I've done in terms of the research, but also just getting to talk to dancers about the research that I'm doing and how they feel about it, is that if you're looking at anxiety about a career trajectory, that's again because they've got this one very narrow focus on what it is probably to be a professional ballet dancer. So I think if I could kind of indicate anything, that the best thing that I think we can do for somebody who is on a career trajectory into dance is to take the same approach of kind of broadening their horizons about what it is to be a professional dancer. Because I think often that anxiety is, I have to perform in order to feel that the investment has been worth it. And therefore, if I can't perform or if I'm without a contract, my self-esteem is low, my worth is threatened by it. So I think my advice with this is that we want to try to open up that view of what it is to be a professional dancer, and take the same approach that if we want their perfectionism to open up so they can be more creative, we also want the view of what a dancer is to open up, to be broader. And the more that we can teach people that there are different ways you can be a dancer, or there are different things that you can do as a dancer, the less anxious that they'll be. And again, if we think about, if we trained more dancers specifically in trying to engage with creativity, that might mean they had more career possibilities at the end of it, and therefore reduce the anxiety about the career trajectory as well. So I really think it's important to just open up, expose people to more ideas or more possibilities of what that career could be. And in the research that I've done that's looked at creativity in professional dancers, ballerinas, and male ballet dancers, it's really striking to me because we asked them about their kind of, when did this desire to also choreograph and be creative come in the timeline of training in this very elite kind of focused way. And it's really interesting that all of them just told us, but I kind of always knew, and even when I was in this ballet training, I had this really open view that I didn't need to be my worth was more than just this way that I was being treated in the ballet school. So I think it's really important to just broaden that, because that will probably leave you in a healthier place and with more career possibilities.
And I think that kind of brings me very nicely to the last question I just want to ask. And it's great that we have you here, and just I always sort of think it's nice to have sort of those top tips, those sort of little bits of information that maybe you can leave us with. So what top tips do you have for the dance professionals here today regarding the integration of knowledge from dance psychology into dance training, making and performing?
Yeah. Okay. So I think just if I just reflect on my journey from my PhD through the creativity and perfectionism research, the autonomy research, I think it's about finding in this career, whether you are a performer, a teacher, a director, a choreographer, your time to just be you and be free from that environment and find your moment of who am I? What do I like about this? Whether that's through taking time to be creative or whether that's finding other parts of you. But the main thing that I really see now about if we boil it all down to what would I say is the concern for a dancer, it's that the identity becomes really consumed by I must dance to be worth something. So it's take a bit of time out of your your life, your kind of pie chart of who you are, to insert something else. And whether that's being creative, whether that's working on something else, that will do wonders for your overall self-concept and self-worth, because you're defining your kind of worth in not just I'm a dancer and I must dance to be worthwhile. So I think that's the bottom line, is don't ever let like, if you've got a pie chart, don't ever let the pie chart be only full of dancing and performing, but let other things in. That's the best thing that we can do for our psychological well-being, is to have this really rounded sense of who we are.
Wow, great. I think we have no more questions, and I think this is probably a really good time to wrap up. So Lucie, thank you so much for your contribution today. It's been amazing. It's always great. I've come away from this session personally with all these little tidbits. I'm like thinking, oh yeah, I've got to do a little bit of that, a little bit more of that. You know, self-care, continue to be creative, all those sorts of things, especially in this really anxious time of COVID. So thank you so much for today. Now for the audience, I would like to just remind everyone that we actually have another webinar coming up on the 5th of May, 6 to 7 o'clock with Erin Sanchez. And Erin's going to be talking about advocacy for dancers' health and well-being. And Erin's an amazing researcher and dance advocate, and she works with a lot of very interesting organizations in the UK and around the world, and it'll be a very interesting session. So thank you all. Thank you, Lucie. And we look forward to seeing you again maybe soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.